Okay, so in these lectures, I want to talk about Kantianism. And I think to do this, it'll help to start with some of the problems with consequentialism, with utilitarianism. Remember, I said utilitarianism fit with a lot of our moral thinking. It does pretty well in a lot of cases, and it's a really natural way to approach a lot of moral dilemmas. But there are sometimes utilitarianism doesn't do as well. As we saw last time, it has real problems with fairness. Not that it's going to generally recommend doing something unfair, but it doesn't take fairness to be important in and of itself. Fairness is only important because other people value fairness and they tend to get angry when we act unfairly. So sometimes utilitarianism, you can easily imagine cases where it will recommend doing something that's really unfair. My example last time, a student who wanted me to push up her grade for no good reason except the fact that she was annoying me and annoying a lot of other people, that was pretty minor, that was pretty trivial. But you can think of other cases where the unfairness seems more important. You can easily imagine a case where a crime's been committed, public's upset, there's a lot of pressure on the police to solve it, so they frame somebody, right? And of course, the utilitarian would say, well, if you frame someone, it might come out, that'll create bad consequences. But again, as with the grade case, that seems to miss the point. The point is you shouldn't do that because that's not fair. If you're saying, well, you shouldn't do that because you might get caught and that would have bad consequences, that just seems to miss the point of why we shouldn't frame people for crimes they didn't commit. Which brings us to the other problem with utilitarianism, which is that it doesn't do well with respect for persons. These two are tied together. Part of respect for persons is we shouldn't treat them in ways that are fundamentally unfair, such as framing them for a crime, or in the example from last time, murdering them for their organs. So Kantianism, deontological theories generally will do better on these 2 points. Now they're going to have their own problems, which I will talk about in the lecture after this, but they do have some advantages over consequentialist theories. Kantianism definitely has some advantages over utilitarianism. Now there's one other thing that I think we should note. Your reading did a good job with this, and this is another advantage of Kantianism. Consequentialist theories, generally utilitarianism in particular, will say that all that matters are the consequences. But that doesn't seem to be true. The consequences matter, yes, but it also seems to matter how we're involved in bringing those consequences about. Think back to the train example from last time. Philosophers often call this the trolley problem because in normal examples, it's often a trolley, right? So I said, well, most of us would probably flip the switch and send the train or the trolley down the track where there was one person so it wouldn't run over the 5 people. But as your reading points out, in an interestingly similar case, that's probably not our reaction. If you could somehow stop the trolley by pushing another person in front of it, directly pushing them, well, while most of us would flip the switch, most of us would not push this person. So why is that? Are we just squeamish? Do we just not like having our hands directly involved? That seems like what the utilitarian would say, right? Because the consequences are pretty much the same. 5 people saved, 1 person killed. On balance, you save 4 lives in both cases. How in the world are they different? Well, they're different because of the way you're involved. And utilitarianism can't seem to account for that, but as your reading pointed out, Kantianism, deontological theories, well, they might do better. Okay, so let's move on and start talking about what we mean by deontology. So deontology, or deontological, if you want to use it as an adjective to talk about deontological theories, it's just a really fancy way of saying rules-based. So a deontological moral theory is based on rules. And what that means is the theory is going to say that there are certain moral rules and you should not break these rules no matter what. You can think of this This is actually a fairly natural way to think, right? One of those rules might be you shouldn't frame an innocent person for a crime he didn't commit. Or another might be you shouldn't murder another human being for his organs, right? So what happens here is the rules-based theory will say even if in some way following the rules might not have the best consequences, the rules are more important than the consequences. Even if you might create good consequences by pushing somebody in front of the tram, or by framing an innocent person, or by killing someone for their organs, the rules say don't do that, and the rules ought to trump the consequences. Okay. Well, so I think if you're going to talk about a rules-based theory, well, two questions ought to occur to you. So one, what in the world are those rules, right? You know, we can probably all think of a series of moral rules, things we don't do, but how do we know what the rules are? Is it just some grab bag of rules that randomly occurs to us, or is there some principled way we can figure out what those rules are? Secondly, why in the world are these particular rules important? If you're going to tell me, well, you shouldn't do this even if there are really bad consequences for not doing it, you know, 5 people dying because you don't push the guy in front of the tram, well, you need to tell me why the rules are important, why I shouldn't break the rules when it has good consequences to break them. So I think a good way to understand Kantianism, a good way to get into the theory, is to see how it tries to answer these two questions. Now, as with consequentialism and utilitarianism, there are other forms of deontological moral theory besides Kant's. They're not as important, so we will focus on Kantianism. It's the most important kind of deontological theory. Consequentialism is a family of theories. Deontological theories are a family of theories. You know, with consequentialism, we'll only be talking about utilitarianism. With Kantianism, we'll only talk, or sorry, with deontology, we'll only talk about Kantianism. Okay, so how does Kantianism try to answer these two questions? So Kantianism, it actually takes its name from this philosopher Immanuel Kant. So we'll look at how Kant himself tried to answer these two questions. And your reading focuses on the formula of humanity. Never treat another human being as a mere means, always treat human beings as ends in themselves. Now, I think this is pretty important, but Kant actually had two ways of trying to answer this question. Formula of universal law, which I'll spend most of this presentation talking about, and the formula of humanity, which we'll focus on in the next one. Well, so how are these supposed to work? Well, before we can see that, we'll have to take a step back. And one thing that we should notice is to think about what happens when we do something, when we perform some kind of action. And Kant will say what is important, what we should notice is that human beings always have reasons for their actions. If you get up in the morning and go running, if I ask you why you did that, you can tell me. If you call a friend up that you haven't talked to for a while, if I ask you why you did that, you can tell me, maybe you go running because it calms you down, it clears your head, maybe you want to lose weight, maybe some combination of all three. Maybe you call your friend because you miss him, but you have reasons for what you do. Now, of course, we're not always thinking of the reasons for what we do. I might just sort of absent-mindedly go and get a cup of coffee in the morning. I'm not always thinking, oh, coffee's delicious, coffee will wake me up, I will be a horrible person, no one will like me because I'm so grumpy if I don't drink my coffee. But if you ask me why I'm getting the coffee, I can tell you. So Kant will say, look at your reasons for action. Why are you doing what you're doing? Or why are you considering doing something? And Kant will say, let's take these reasons for action, these principles, and if we take them and we run them through these two tests, the formula of universal law, the formula of humanity, if we run the principles that we consider acting on through these tests, that will tell us what the moral rules are. Okay, so how in the world is this supposed to work? Let's start with the formula of universal law, which your reading barely discusses at all. So the formula of universal law says, well, think about your principle and then follow two steps. Let's say I'm thinking of doing something. I ask myself, what is the general principle behind the action I'm considering? Now, Kant's example, let's take something like something that's obviously immoral. Let's imagine that I am in financial difficulty, I need some money, and I'm thinking about lying to a friend to get that money. I'll say to him, loan me $1,000, I'll pay you back in a month. I think he's a nice guy. I think he's way too nice to ever sue me if I don't pay him back. I have no intention of paying him back. So Kant would say, well, what's the general principle behind that action? Then, once I have the general principle, I should ask myself, could I will that everyone in similar circumstances act on that principle? If the answer is no, then I have a rule against that sort of action. If in this case the answer is no, then I have a general rule, don't lie to people to get money. Okay, so how does this actually work in practice? Let's stick with our lying to get money example. So my principle is probably something like, whenever I need money and can get it by making a lying promise, I will make a lying promise. So if I picture that universalized, as Kant would say, if I picture everybody acting on that principle, then the principle becomes something like, whenever anyone needs money and can get it by making a lying promise, she will do that. Now notice something Kant would say. The fact that you could maybe successfully lie to someone and get money out of them depends on the fact that not everyone does it. In a world where every single human being always lied whenever they needed money, what do you think would happen? Well, no one would ever loan anyone any money. Or if they did, they'd make darn sure the person had to pay them back. So Kant will say, look, notice the fact that the very fact that I could maybe successfully act on this principle depends on the fact that not everybody does it. In fact, most people don't do it. Most people are honest. They don't try to defraud their friends. If everybody always tried to tell a lie whenever they needed money, well, the principle of whenever I need money I can get it by lying wouldn't even work. It would never be successful that you would get money by lying to someone. So you can't imagine this principle as a universal law. You can't imagine everyone successfully acting on it because it depends on not everybody doing it. And if the fact that I could do something successfully depends on the fact that not everybody does it, then Kant will say it fails this formula of universal law. So the lying promise fails this formula of universal law because in a world where everybody tried to act on that principle, no one would be able to successfully act on it. So I think another example will also help. And the other example I'm thinking of is shoplifting. So imagine that I'm thinking of shoplifting, something I'm not. I don't want you guys to get the idea that shoplifting is like a hobby of mine. But let's imagine that I am thinking of stealing something from the store. So my general principle behind the action I'm considering is probably something like, Whenever I want something from a store and can steal it, I will steal it. Kant would say, well, think about this. Think about the universalized principle. When anyone wants anything from a store and can get it by stealing, she will steal it. If everybody always acted on the principle of stealing what they want, well, then nobody would be able to successfully steal. Why? Because the very fact that we can maybe successfully steal something from a store depends on the fact not everyone does it. Imagine what the world would be like if everyone did that. If everyone did that, leaving the Nordstrom, leaving the JCPenney would be like getting on an airplane. They'd run you through a metal detector, they would pat you down, they would probably x-ray you, or maybe if it wasn't like that, maybe every store would be like this gas station I used to live next to. You can probably guess what the neighborhood was like from these details, but everything was behind about a half inch of glass. You put your money in the thing, they rotate it around, they take your money, they rotate back whatever you want from them, right? The point being, if everyone always stole, you couldn't successfully steal because people would take measures against it. So Kant would say, well, the fact that you could possibly successfully steal depends on the fact that not everyone does this. All right, not every action that's ruled out by the formula of universal law fails in this way. Some principles fail because you can't imagine a world where everyone successfully acts on the principle. The very fact that anybody could successfully act on the principle depends on the fact people don't generally do it. But there are other principles that fail that you can imagine everyone successfully acting on. It's just that you would not want to live in a world where everybody did that. So a good example of this is failing to help others. Imagine that I see a person drowning in shallow water, and I ask myself, well, should I save him or not? Of course, I'm not a sociopath. I wouldn't be thinking that. I would just save the person if I could. But let's imagine I do think that, right? Kant would say, well, what's your principle if you don't help this person? It's probably something like, I will never help another human being in trouble unless there's something in it for me. Well, then ask yourself, would you want to live in a world where everyone acts on that principle? I bet you wouldn't. Well, why not? Think for a second, why would you not want to live in a world where everyone acts on the principle, don't help another person out unless there's some kind of reward in it? Well, the reason is, of course, you might be the person who needs help. We human beings, we're fragile, we're prone to bad luck. We might be the person drowning in shallow water. We might be the person who's knocked out. We might be the person getting mugged. And if we are, we would want other people to help us. So we wouldn't want everyone to act on this principle, don't help others. We might need help. Let's take one more example of a possible principle that fails this test in this way. We can imagine people successfully acting on it, but we wouldn't want to live in a world where everyone did. So this other principle I have in mind is, let's imagine someone who's quite wealthy. He has a trust fund. Let's imagine, not only does he not need to work for a living, but he doesn't even need to manage his money. So he can just sit there and draw the check every month. He doesn't need to do anything. Well, let's imagine this person has some talents. He could make some contributions to society. He's just lazy. He doesn't want to. He wants to sit around, drink beer, play Xbox all day. It's all he wants to do, and he can get away with being this lazy because he has money that someone has left him, so he doesn't actually need to work or really do anything. Well, is it morally acceptable to be this lazy? Kant would say no. Imagine this person trying to universalize his principle. He asks himself, could I will that everyone act on my principle? Could I will that everyone do the bare minimum they need to do to be comfortable? Kant would say he couldn't. Well, why not? Well, you can imagine a world where everybody's this lazy, but in a world where everybody's this lazy, this person wouldn't get the things he enjoys, right? Somebody needs to create the games that he plays on his Xbox. Somebody needs to brew the beer. What's more, somebody needed to actually earn the money, fund the trust fund he's living off of. So if everyone were this lazy, well, he wouldn't even have the money. So he can imagine a world where everybody's as lazy as he is, but he wouldn't want to live in that world. So the principle, be as lazy as you can get away with being, or, as I put it here, do the bare minimum to be comfortable. You can't universalize it. You wouldn't want to live in that world. No one would want to live in that world. They'd want other people to work so they could have things. So that principle fails this formula of universal law. Okay, so to sum up, let's ask ourselves, how successful is this formula of universal law? How does it do? Remember, I said that when we're talking about a rules-based theory, we want the theory to be able to answer two questions. What are the rules? How do we know what they are? And why are the rules important? Now, I think the formula of universal law does pretty well with the what are the rules question, right? We've already seen it can give you a rule of don't lie to get money, or don't shoplift. You see it gives you those rules, you see how it gives you those rules. You also get rules like help other human beings when they're in trouble, or develop your talents even when you could be lazy and get away with not doing so. So I think the formula of universal law is pretty good at telling us what the moral rules are. Now, it might not be perfect. We'll talk a little bit next time. There might be some problems here on one, but it does pretty well. I don't think it does so well with the why are they important question. Well, why not? Well, look, think back to elementary school when your teacher told you, well, how would you like it if everybody did that, right? I'm thinking of a field trip we were on. I'm not the person who did this. But one kid just grabs an apple, we're at this orchard, and starts eating it, right? Probably not the best idea. I mean, the thing was probably coated in poison, but anyway. So he starts eating the apple, and the teacher's like, well, would you want to live in a world where everybody did that? There wouldn't be any apples on the tree. You wouldn't want to live in that world, would you? You couldn't get any apples. Now, this kid didn't say anything because when we were in school, you could still get paddled, and he probably didn't want to get taken behind the stage and whipped. A lot of my elementary school teachers had some frustrations they were taking out that way, so it was pretty bad. But look, what I'm sure he was thinking, and what I would have been thinking in that situation was, well, yeah, I wouldn't want everybody to do it because I want to be able to get apples. Yeah, of course. But I don't see why that means I can't do it. No, I don't want to live in a world where everybody does it. Goodness, no. But why does the fact that I wouldn't want to live in a world where everybody does it mean that it's important I don't do it? Now, of course, we didn't ask our teacher. We didn't want to get beaten, but I think this is a perfectly good question. And I'm not so sure that the formula of universal law has a great answer to this question. So how might we answer this why are the rules important question? Well, I think Kant's formula of humanity will help us to answer this question. I think it'll actually do a pretty good job of answering the question of why the rules are important. So that's what we'll start on in the next lecture. What's the formula of humanity? How might it answer this question?